So micro front ends in a brief overview nutshell kind of thing. So let's get on to how we can go about actually coding this. Requirements initially. This is all new in Angular 11, which has just been out, I guess, a few weeks or so. So if you're looking to play around with micro front ends or actually implement them, then you're going to need to either upgrade or start a new CLI project with Angular 11. Second thing is Yarn. So the reason we need Yarn is that Module Federation comes with Webpack 5. And although Angular 11 and the CLI support Webpack 5, it's still in experimental phase. So it's not like that out of the box. So what we're going to do is we're going to use Yarn, and Yarn supports this natively, this resolutions key in your package JSON file. And what that allows you to do is to say, anytime a package depends on Webpack, regardless of what version it's actually requesting, just override it with this one. We know better, so we want to supply version 5. And so what that means is, and you put this before your dependencies in the package JSON. And so when you do an npm or a yarn install, fetch Angular, and Angular's going to say, I only need Webpack version 4, and Yarn's going to go, okay, I'm going to give you version 5. And that allows us to then use Module Federation. And to switch to using Yarn, if you're maybe using npm, for example, like a lot of people probably are, you can just run this terminal command, ngconfig cli.packagemanager yarn. And all that does is update your angular.json file and tell the CLI to use Yarn instead of npm. So I think we can get onto how we can configure the remote, the micro front ends. It's like a lot of mostly white code, but as I step through it, it'll highlight the lines, so hopefully it's not too hard to read. If you can't see it or it's too small, please let me know. So yeah, first things first, as Webpack 5 isn't supported directly in Angular 11 yet, like I say, it's still experimental. It's not completely baked into this CLI. So what we need to do is actually just supply an extra config file, which we put in, in our source directory within the Microfrontends folder. A bit of Webpack config that sets up the module federation and allows the remote, the Microfrontend, and this line is to include the module federation Webpack plugin. So this line, this is the public path, and this is the module federation Webpack. We tell that where this remote is going to live. So if you remember, all the different micro front ends and the hosts, they're all deployed in completely different places. And as such, we need to keep a register of where they all are deployed. So in this instance, 3000, it's just a dev build, but in production, obviously you would have that somewhere else. Apple.com/iPhone, for example. And you can switch this out a few different ways. I guess you could substitute this with a value from your environment file, or you could include a script within the consuming applications index.html instead. As the starting point. So the next part of the configuration is the. Sorry, go ahead.
Paul, just one thing. The exposes iPhone main module, is that a string or what is it?
I'll get through to that in a sec. I'll step down through the different lines, and then,
okay,
and then I'll explain what that does. But it's a good question. So yeah, these highlighted areas, these highlighted lines, these are just where we register a unique name of this particular remote. So obviously, if we have various micro front ends all being loaded into each other or into a host, we need to make sure that those don't conflict. So we need, as developers, we're going to need some way of keeping track of these and having a contract between teams to ensure that we don't override each other's names, right? This next line you might see in some examples, and it's completely not necessary to get a kind of starting point with micro front ends. But what this will do is it will mean that Webpack exposes on a global variable of the name iPhone a means to retrieve that remote module. So I can demonstrate that. So yeah, this slide deck, this application is an Angular application, and it's actually built using micro-frontends. So it's a, if I just, so if I just show you what we can do, using this line here, like I say, it sets up a global variable. This application is called slides. And so what this might be used for is if you don't want to use Angular to instantiate your remote modules, you can actually just use this and do it programmatically yourself. So you could do slides.get, something like that, or get returns a promise. And so what you can see here in the network tab is just downloaded that remote module. Stuff we need for the slides section, which is the central part of the micro front end. It's just a development build, but it's 203 kilobyte production build. That's a tiny little module. And so that has loaded the separate module in. That's the purpose. I want to do that programmatically, but we'll show how to actually do that with Angular and routing coming up soon. So the file name entry, that's uses that particular file path that we defined earlier. It takes this little Webpack runtime and it uses that runtime to then basically do what I just did in the console, to actually grab the module and instantiate it and all that stuff. Magic starts happening. And then we'll get onto this next line. So as you can see, it's called exposes, and this is where this remote application, this micro front end, can define exactly which parts of its internals it wants to expose. So this is, for example, the iPhone page, and we're going to export the iPhone main module, and that's then available to the host to consume and to navigate to, with the path from the root to the iPhone module. And finally, harking back to what we discussed before, this is the shared dependencies. And so this remote is saying, okay, I want to share Angular core, Angular common, Angular router, RxJS, and so on. That's probably going to be a lot of dependencies. So this is another place where you could run into some traps, and you need to make sure you keep a really solid list somewhere between teams of which dependencies you're using. Okay, so that's the micro front end. Sorry, Tom. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, thanks for spotting me. Just a quick question on that. What happens if you don't share and you have similar dependencies?
You mean if you had the same dependencies between both applications, but neither of them was telling Webpack it was sharing them?
Exactly. So obviously, if we're talking about Angular apps, you know, you've got Angular core as and Angular common and Angular router as the main dependencies. But if you don't specify them as shared, what happens?
So then each application would download it, which is, of course, the exact situation we're trying to avoid. So yeah, that's why it's really important to keep an eye on these dependencies. You know, things like Angular core and common are easy, but there are probably other libraries as well that you might not even realize you're using that sit away in a module somewhere that you haven't thought about, and then they get used in another micro front end, and then you're downloading it twice. So it is a potential pitfall to make sure that there is a document somewhere that keeps track of this. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. So are you saying that the answer equals bloat as opposed to anything bad?
I guess it would be bad if the versions were different. So if one was depending on Angular 9 and one was depending on Angular 4, that could cause some problems. But otherwise, if they were the same version, then it would just be bloat, yeah.
Thank you.
think there was another question from someone.
Excuse me, please. If we use, for example, Angular CLI, in case of using Angular CLI, in this case, we need to eject the Webpack configuration to add this configuration. What we'll do in this case?
No, you don't. No, you don't need to do that. I'm not sure exactly how it works, but it just works.
Thank you.
Okay. So yeah, the next section is how we configure the host, the application that's then going to consume the micro front end. And it looks really similar to what we've just seen. Again, we have the public path where the host is hosted on the internet, a unique name. And then we're specifying this record of the various remotes that we want to consume. So you might recognize this bit. This is the public path of the remote that we just configured. And then this is the Webpack runtime that we specified. Things together, combined with the name of the remote, is how we specify that particular remote history. And yeah, and then we have, again, we have an array of shared dependencies, this time for the host. So if there was another dependency that, oh, we have a question. What did it say? It's on the chat, right?
Yes, it's on the chat.
Must the remote type be hard-coded on the domain? I'm not sure what you mean, but if you mean must it be hard-coded into this file, switch that out with so you could put this in your environment file and then use a different environment file based on your continuous integration, depending on where you're deploying it to. So you can then test on dev, test, and if you didn't want to use it here, you can also a script tag in your HTML file that will include this, have that as the source of the script tag, and that will also do the same thing. It just loads up that run and has access to it. I'm not sure if that answered the question. Hopefully it did. Okay, so we've got the remote and we've got the host, and we're not kind of programmatically loading in the module ourselves yet. So nothing's going to happen, right? So we need to actually route to that remote. And we do that just how we would with any other lazy loaded module. So we're now on the iPhone site and we've clicked on the iPhone link. And this is a pretty standard pattern that you may be familiar with. Using dynamic imports to lazy load a route. So this isn't like your standard import statement at the top of a TypeScript file. This is a function, and it returns a promise. So what it's doing here is using the name of the remote, and then we're using that iPhone main module, which is the exposed module that we declared previously. When Webpack runs, it's going to know what this means, and it's then going to return the actual module class. So it looks exactly like any other lazy loaded module, but actually in reality, it's fetching that from a completely different server. And just one little can need to put a d.ts file, which is like a TypeScript, and just declare that this module exists, because it doesn't, English TypeScript doesn't know that actually exists. So we just declare this. You may have seen this kind of pattern before. You're declaring a module and telling TypeScript, even if you can't find it or you're not aware of it. So we've linked through to that, and that's all set up. There's just one tiny little thing left to do, and then it's all going to come together. And this is a lot of white on black code. You don't need to read the code really. if you're familiar with it, you've probably had a look into your main.ts file before. And main.ts is where you tend to bootstrap Angular, set up your application, and then kick it all off so it all loads. And that stuff is all synchronous. But now that we're using module federation, all our dependencies are loaded asynchronously because we need to check, or Webpack needs to check whether they are compatible with each other and so on. And those dependencies include Angular, right? And so if we were trying to bootstrap our application before Angular as a dependency actually existed, that's not going to work. So what we can do is we can take all the stuff that we normally have in our main.ts file, and we'll just put it in another file called, say, bootstrap.ts. And then we dynamically import, just like we did on the other page, we dynamically import our bootstrapping code, and that then becomes asynchronous. And because that's asynchronous, Webpack can work with it and work with the asynchronous dependencies, and it will all work. So that's it. That you're then going to have an application that can link through to a completely separate module in a completely separate deployed application, and it will work. So to get onto dependencies, and yeah, a couple of people have mentioned this already. Like we said before, sharing dependencies is one of the key benefits of this, as well as kind of structuring your teams. And it can be a tricky monster, I'd imagine, if you have a lot of different dependencies between your applications. The previous example of the Webpack config was a shared array like this. And I mentioned right at the beginning of the talk that monorepos work really well with this approach. And that's because in monorepos, or at least in an Angular monorepo with multiple projects, you're always going to have, most likely going to have a singular package.json. Dependencies and their versions are stored in one place, right? So even if you have multiple teams working within that, you don't need a contract necessarily between teams. You just have a single point of reference to update your various dependencies. If you don't have that approach and you have multiple package JSONs and you're not using a monorepository, then Webpack will look at the package JSON of each micro-frontend and of the host, and it will try to use semantic version matching to establish a common shared dependency version between the two. Ideally, you want to just use the same if you can, but if you can't, this is what it's going to do. So it's going to this supports minor and patch updates and find common ground based on that. So that is going to support anything up to 10.9999.9. And the next line, if we're using the tilde operator, is going to support patch updates. So that might support 6.6.1000, but not above, or not above 6.7. So we have to be a bit wary of this, because this is really helpful when we're kind of telling package JSON how we want to version our packages. But we have to be wary that we're not excluding other packages from other micro-frontends. So again, this is something you really want to the other teams. Okay, so any questions on that so far?
Have you done much around the versioning?
How do you mean?
I'm just wondering, have you tried playing with apps that had different versions?
A little bit, yeah. Nothing drastic, like different version of Angular or anything like that. But that would be problems can start to happen.
Yeah, I think the big one is this one to play that.
Yeah, we can actually turn that into this record and then just have the name of each dependency as the key, and then you can provide extra config. So yeah, strict version true is going to actually throw an error, and that will be logged out in the browser. Actually, like I say, you're only going to see that at runtime. You're not going to see it in build. So definitely want to catch that as early as possible. And then this last bit is, hopefully it's pretty clear what that does, but you're specifying a version range which you know this to work with. So if you look through the change logs, this NgRx store is going to be compatible with back to version 7, for example, and well, you're probably going to just leave it at the current version here. Then you can specify that there, and then Webpack can infer from that compatibility and what doesn't. And yeah, just to reiterate that final bullet point, this is, again, somewhere you really want a good contract between your teams to ensure that this stuff is processed and I guess like regulated or directly to avoid major issues. Any questions? Any more questions about versions or mismatching? Okay. Inter-module communication. So it's always loosely coupled, completely independently deployed modules, right? Form a holistic application, and they are going to need to speak to one another in some way. A couple of ways on the next slides, just a brief overview of how you might approach this. By no means have I, this is all new technology, so I haven't used this in an enterprise scenario, see how well things will work, but I can talk about two fairly common means of communicating between different pages or applications. So the first one, and this is event listener, right? So in your micro front end, you might, or sorry, within your host, you set up an event listener, and say you want to update the title at the top of the page. Like, for example, in this repository, I'm updating this every time I go between pages, right? So you might have an event listener in your host, and you say, okay, well, I don't know if I'm going to receive an event, but if I do, I want to set the title class field, the title value from that event. And in our remote, at some point in time, we might decide to trigger a custom event. Event is called update title, and we're just passing in the detail with the iPhone, because we've hit the iPhone page on the apple.com site. So it's super easy to implement this. Of course, you can imagine you'd end up with this huge list of event names that you'd have to keep track of, and it's not really ideal. But if you're just playing around with micro front ends, I found that quite a nice, easy way to just experiment how they interact. And yeah, and so then you've got NgRx, which a lot of people are probably familiar with. And if you're not, it basically works on the concept of a central store of data, dispatch an action which will update that, and then you can also draw data from that central store. And so what I'm doing is, in the host, I've configured my store, and the name of the title is, if I just have a look at the Redux, it's a very simple state. You can see I have a UI feature, and it just stores the title within here. And every time I click between one of these pages, you'll see it's triggering the name of the title to be updated, right? And I'm just doing that with store.dispatch, which, if you're familiar with NgRx, will be nothing new to you. But one key point to mention is that you'll see here, I'm just using a standard object literal with the name of the unique name of the action here to dispatch. Normally I'd have an export from perhaps ui.actions.ts, and I'll then reference that export and dispatch that. But to do that was kind of beyond the scope of this repository, because you have to create a shared library, because that has to be accessible within the host and within the remote, and you can't import from one to the other. So what you'd do is you'd create a shared library with your shared state within it, your actions, selectors, and so on. and then any micro front end or the host that wishes to use that could then import that shared library and reference it from there. And then, of course, that shared library you could add to your shared dependencies list, so it only actually gets downloaded once. And so that's kind of magic.
So, Paul, in this case, we need to ensure that a single NgRx store instance is created, correct? In your host application?
Yeah, and it's kind of an interesting point. I think you broke up a bit there, so hopefully you can still hear everything. There's an interesting point I found with this is that micro front ends can technically be run in isolation. They don't have to be host, right? They can just be a completely independently deployed application that can be included if you want to. But one of the problems I ran into with that approach is that with NgRx, you have to register your store at root level, right?
Correct.
So if you're running your micro front ends independently, it needs to register at root. But if you want to load it within your host, the host has to register at root, and your micro front end would register at feature level. So, and as far as I know, there's no way of kind of conditioning loading the store module for feature or for root. It strikes me that it could be something useful to actually add that as a config for the injector. So I might look into that. But yeah, just for the scope of this talk, I didn't make any progress on finding a good solution for that.
I guess if you are lazy, if you are loading individual pages in a micro front end, like, but they could individually have store for feature in it, right? And the for root would be within your host application, probably would, because that's the one that registers your store with the root provider. But the pages that you import in your as a remote in your host application, they could just probably in their module have 4 features in them. In that way, probably.
Yeah, so exactly. That's what I've done for this repository for the slide deck. But if you were then to try front end, the micro front end on its own, it won't work because it doesn't have the for root registered.
Correct.
Root state to be initialized before for feature will work. But nonetheless, it's if you're sure that that micro front end will always be kind of host environment, then yeah, it works great. And, the proof of concept, as you can see, is it's updating the title at the top here. Have any other questions about that stuff?
Hi, Paul. Yeah, good presentation. So I guess on the same note, on NgRx, if we have multiple modules, then or multiple states in the different remotes, we have to make sure again that they have in unique names, because I suppose otherwise they would clash, or the last one would override the previous one.
Yeah, I guess that would be the same as if they were just all within the same application. When you register for feature, you give it like a feature key, right? So whether that would be UI.
Yes, yeah.
So I haven't tried that, but I suppose if you tried to run for feature with an existing key, it probably would just override it.
It would have been nice if there was something like, you know, as we have the unique ID for each remote to kind of have it, whatever is part of that remote in the store, in the global store, to be underneath that key, kind of, you know.
Yeah.
Like
so
you had slides. Yeah, that would be nice.
The constant or something like that. And then you could use that all throughout the micro front end, I suppose.
Yeah.
Hi, Paul.
Hello.
Yes, so are we saying without a global store initialized, we cannot run separate micro front ends, is it?
No, it's only if those micro front ends wish to use NgRx.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm not sure. Are you familiar with NgRx?
Yes, yeah.
So what you'll commonly have is in your app module, or somewhere near the top of that kind of module hierarchy, you'll register NgRx store dot for root, and then you'll create an object with whatever kind of root level details you want, and then in your eager or lazy loaded modules, you'd then have your stores. And without that for root, the for feature just won't work.
So what happens in case if there are two micro frontends? Which frontend will have the for root store?
So in the example I gave with like the apple.com site, you would want the for root in your apple.com in the host.
Okay.
As that's effectively like the app module in a standard application, it kind of feels that's the sensible place to put it.
Okay. So
ideally, you'd have a way of determining whether for root has been initialized, and if it hasn't, then initialize it, you know?
Okay, so we can still run micro frontends separately.
Yeah, they can still run separately.
Okay. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.
So, Paul, I think to that end, it's a very good fit for this concept of enterprise Angular monorepo patterns, because the data access libraries sort of fit that model where you have, you know, effectively a root loader and then ones that you load for features.
Yeah.
But I know that you've been reading up on Manfred Steyer's thing, because I gather your repo is based on his example.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I've got the final slides, and it's got a few links on there. So yeah, I was sending a few emails back and forth with Manfred, and Manfred Steyer to him because he's basically the eminent guy who's worked all this stuff out with Angular and Module Federation, and he's just brilliant. I've been in a 3-day workshop with him this week, and he's
really so I hadn't realized that you were actually with the man, you know, because he's a dude.
He is. Yeah. So there's a few links here. The first one is to basically the first time I heard about anyone using Module Federation in Angular. He's written like a 5-part, I think, blog post on it. I've just tried to adapt a bit for this presentation. And then he's also got this plugin here, which is available on NPM, and it removes a lot of that duplicating config stuff for you. It saves you a lot of time if you're making a bunch of these micro frontends.
It's just a schematic of sorts. Looks like it, isn't it?
Sorry, say again.
Nothing. Sorry. Yeah, it's.
So yeah, I highly recommend when you start playing around with this stuff to use this. And he has various repositories on GitHub, one of which, as Tom says, are used as kind of the basis for getting this stuff working. Look at this repository itself, then you can have a look on my GitHub account.
I've got a couple of questions, Paul, if that's all right.
Okay.
Yeah. So I gather Webpack 5 Module Federation is actually still in beta. Am I correct?
No, it's released now.
Is it really? Because yeah, the internet has been full of it's beta, it's experimental, but it's not anymore.
It's legit, but the integration with Angular is experimental.
Oh, yes, right, that makes sense. Yeah. Okay.
But I would imagine with Angular 12, whenever that comes out, then it would probably be, completely integrated.
Yeah, from the stuff that I've seen, it does appear that, you know, it's the next version basically that's going to solidify it.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Paul.
Sorry, Paul, are you using this in production then at LNG?
No, definitely not. It's still super new, so I don't want that on my head.
Yeah, fair enough. But I guess you're kind of following it and hoping to roll it out, or is this more of a interest?
I can definitely see an application for it at LNG, a potential application. On a repository, and you're thinking about using micro-frontends, I think you've got more work ahead of you than if you were already using a mono repo.
Yeah, sure.
I see a chap called, I think he's Brawny, has posted a message in the chat asking you a question, Paul.
Yeah, so that was about the using Webpack 5, which is experimental. So supports Webpack 5, but only experimentally. Tell it to resolve any dependencies on Webpack to version 5 instead of what Angular actually asks for. Thanks.
I think you deserve a virtual round of applause, Paul. That was awesome.
Yeah, that was really good.
I'm going to start a slow clap.
Thank you very much.
Cheers, Paul. So yeah, I'm managing
use and the scenarios that this applies to. So and gave us some very sensible sort of pipe operators combinations to sort of address some of those issues. But that was a good short intro, and I'm going to see if we can, you know, in quotes, level up and use the NgRx component store. So I'll page on. So what is NgRx component store? Well, here's a colorful slide to describe it. Okay. In a nutshell, this is what it does. It's got selectors, updaters, and effects. And there's an example from the actual docs of what each does. So you can have a quick scan down there. But the main objective with the selector is to give you, in this case, our view model. And it has some built-in pipe operators that it does for you. It does, let me see, it does the combine latest on all of the inputs, and it does debounce that's optional, which is a custom debounce operator that does some extra stuff around sort of like the start of a string to try and sort of pick up what's in the queue on the micro tasks and stick them all together as one event. And then the last operator is distinct until changed, which Max mentioned. And so you get as clean a VM observable as is possible. The updaters are very different in concept to a normal NgRx store reducer, which is the sort of equivalent of what an updater is. The main difference being that an updater is based on an observable, and so therefore has the ability to be asynchronous, which reducers are not supposed to. Which begs the reason for why do we have effects? Because in the original NgRx, NgRx store, we have effects so as to reduce the need for doing asynchronous things to inside reducers. Whereas in this case, the main benefit that I found from effects, the way that they are used in the component store, is that they give you the ability to replace wherever you would use subscribe in a component. And also, and I'll mention this red box in the bottom left there, the recommended pattern, which is a component provided service to hold the state. It allows you to actually technically do what is a subscribe inside a service. But it does that because it has access to the life cycle hooks, which surprised to me. I hadn't realized until I looked at the code for component store, but services also have life cycle hooks just the same as components. I don't know if you guys knew that, but that was news to me. And that allows this whole thing to just have a chain where you can have an effect that is hooked into observable and then unsubscribed when the component just go to the main advantage. I think it's a really big takeaway. Our code again, which to my mind is probably the biggest reason that you might want to use component store. Does anybody have any questions about that?
One question about the lifecycle events, Tom.
Sure.
I guess that's if you provide the service in the providers array for the component. I guess that's how it knows about the lifecycle of the component. Is that right?
That's precisely right. Yes. Okay. I glossed over that, so let's come back to that bit. Okay, I'll just click on here. Okay, so the recommended pattern is a component provided service. Okay, and as you say, the providers array inside the component metadata allows you to actually create a service that has a lifespan of the component. And so therefore it becomes the component state object, if you like. Okay. And I think that's really powerful and neat and compartmentalized, separation of concerns, the whole deal. So yeah. So rather than page through and do death by presentation, I'm going to leave it there for a second and just go into some code. Now, if you had the links I posted earlier in the chat, you'll have access to this repo. But to make sure that you do, I'm going to give you the links anyway in the chat. Okay, so let's have a go at that. Okay, here we go. All right, so now you've got some bedtime reading ahead of you. And I'm going to take you to some code. The repo is the second link in the chat that I've just posted there. Okay, you're welcome to clone it. The idea here is that I'm sort of doing a progression, and if you go to the actual GitHub page, which is probably worth a mention, and I'll do that by just popping that in to highlight. You'll see that the README actually has links to branches and PRs to show the progression of the code that I've created. The main branch is just using a behavior subject, much similar to the way Max described. And then I've shown the progression of going from the behavior subject to using component store inside the component, and then refactoring it into a service, and then finally adding a dummy demo effect. Okay, so what I'm going to do for this demo, so as not to waste time, I'm going to jump from the main branch all the way over to the add demo effect so that we see everything working together. Okay, I hope that's cool. If any questions, you can pipe up right now, but I'll just get stuck in. Okay.
Tom, could you zoom in a little bit, because it's a little bit small on my screen.
Sorry, my apologies. Right, is that sensible?
For me, yeah.
Good. Okay.
Cool.
So you'll see here that I've just basically got an app component. I've done a naughty, and I've put all of my code in the app component, as opposed to having any kind of child and roots in this. And I'll demonstrate what this is up to. Okay, and then we can talk about it. So if I pop over here and I open there, right. So this is our app in progress, and the reason I've created it is just to show two forms of state, very, very simple pieces of state within the component. They are a tick box to enable a form, and a tab component that allows you to sort of switch between two little views. Okay, so both those pieces of state are stored in component store. And then I've got a global NgRx store that allows me to add and store books. So I'm just going to do a code, and I'm going to do book 1, and I'll add the book. And down here on the books list, it's just appeared. I'll do 5, 6, 7, 8, and I'll just do book 2. There we go. I've added the book. All right. So that's how it works. Okay. Hopefully it's fairly simple to understand. That is the objective here. And you can see here we've got two methods to show form toggle and select tab, which hopefully sort of describe what we're talking about. And you'll see the local state here is, oh, sorry, stop selecting that bit. Local state is set up here. And then the VM, what that does is it does a combine latest on the local state plus the global state, which is a feature for all books. It's a selector, I should say, for all books. Does that make sense so far on my sort of behavior subject version? Okay, so now I'm going to flip to the final version rather than the progression, because I don't want to waste time with that. Okay, and here we go. Right, boom. So the app component has got much simplified, okay, because I'm going to actually hide away all of the store and both the global store and the local state into an app component state service, okay, which I'm providing in the component itself. So never touch the module, never touch the root, okay, it's provided there, all right. The VM just picks up the state, which is the service state, and it's got a VM observable exposed. And then for each of my special methods where I select stuff, okay, it's just passed directly into the state service. And then finally, when I want to insert a book that's going to add to the global store, it's also passed into the state service. I'm going to handle it there. So let's go and see what happens in that place. Okay, here we are. Keep that open. Right. So first of all, up here, I'm defining a local state interface. Okay, and I'll explain the declare global in a little while. We'll come back to that. But here's the VM. Okay, so it's using component store selector. I want to back up a little bit because the service itself is extending the component store. Okay, this is a standard pattern that NgRx recommend. Okay, rather than trying to use it as an imported service, you just extend your own service and then get access to those methods directly as part of your this. Okay, which is tidier because it's less verbose and it's a natural fit for this service that it should be tied to that. So it's not one of those things you want to do separation of concerns on. Right. So we've got a special selector here that picks up all of the local state in this statement, which is a bit peculiar syntax, if you ask me. I can explain it in detail if anybody wants to ask a question, but I'm going to skip on a little bit. We've then got a selector from the global state, which is just an observable as far as this VM is concerned, or on this selector for the VM. Okay, and it takes both. Whoops, I didn't want to do that. Right, it takes. Come on, over here. There we are. Right, takes both of those parameters to pass them into what's called a projector function, that where you can do manipulations. It's a bit like having a map in your pipe operator. Okay, so you can just do your funky stuff there to merge and create a blob of state. And what I'm doing is I'm taking, what's my dot operator called? I've forgotten now. I'm presenting. Spread operator. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm spreading my local state into this sort of VM object, and then I'm adding the selector as a key or property of this VM object. Okay, in the constructor we use a super function because remember it's extending the component store. Well, this is how you set up your local state. That's your initial function, which I think is really neat. Okay, and then down here we've got two special functions that are sort of more properties than functions, because they're functions assigned to properties, but they do it this way because they've got some funky ways of passing in the extra parameter, because it loads itself, its state, into the function loader, and then allows you to also pass in optional parameters into the functions that you create. So it's a bit peculiar, but that's why it's in that format. And then they do, in terms of updating, they do very similar things to what a reducer does. Okay. Any questions as yet? Good. Okay. Absorbing. Right. And then down here, we've got an effect. Okay. And the example effect that I chose was after a conversation with Dav, who's on the call here, is to just exhibit a Google Analytics event, which, if you imagine I had an observable such as selected tabs, which is what I'm effectively subscribing to, if I wasn't using component store and I was actually inside the component, I might well have a subscription that used the ng-on-destroy thing to unsubscribe, but was actually firing Google Analytics events from that stream. Okay, but the effect allows you to do all of that, and it handles the unsubscribe on destroy type pattern within its own library. And I think that's cool because it allows us to do it in a service, which turns that piece of architecture on its head, because that was a rule before. Don't subscribe in a service. It's naughty. It's an anti-pattern. But now it's okay. Just thought it's worth sharing with you. Okay. And then finally, down in this service, it's got an upsert, and this upsert action is actually performed on the global state, and the global state, if I can just jump into here, okay, is behind a facade, and the facade is actually dispatching an upsert action on the books. And if I go in there, you'll see it's using an entity action because the books are entities. Any questions? Cool. Okay. So I'm going to come back to the presentation if I can find it, which I'm not sure where it is at the second. So let's see if I can find where it's gone. Okay, that'll do. Let's present it. Okay, good. Right. So I'm going to just sort of refer to my notes for a second and slurp my beer. First one of the evening, marvelous. Right. Now, what I was going to say is that both the VM pattern and the component store method or pattern, if you want to call it that, both allow us to use on push, which takes us towards using, doing zoneless development. And I don't know if you guys have heard of zoneless development. Does anybody know what Zone.js is?
Yes.
Oh, Paul. Which one of you wants to tell me what Zone.js is?
I can tell.
Oh, marvelous! Go for it, Dav.
It's a thing which Angular uses to find out when it should trigger change detection in response to when it thinks the data is updated, so that it needs to update the display of it. So
Marvelous.
It's kind of a luxury that you get as Angular devs to not worry about updating the view, and Angular takes care of us behind the scenes for us. But that's as a downside, as you would tell now.
Yes, absolutely. Good. Right. So I'm going to fast forward through this presentation and talk about Zoneless. Oh, it was back there, that one. Right. If you've got access to this presentation, which I think I posted in the chat, if anybody hasn't got it, I'll post it again. Just say so now. Okay. But there's a link here where you can see an experimental way to switch off Zone.js and speed your app into super speeds. Okay. But in order to do so, you have to use some of the latest experimental NgRx component tools, which is not to be mistaken for component store. They have an NgRx let operator, which is to replace the async pipe. And they also have, what was the other one?
Push.
The push. Yeah, I've lost my plot there. It might be better to just jump to the thingammy, which has gone desperately wrong. Let's see if I can come out of this. There we are. And if I click on there, now I can see him. Yeah, that's much better. Right, happy. Okay, so they've got these tools which are down here. Yeah, we've got an NgRx push pipe and an NgRx let directive. So which replaces the ngIf, so that you can do this whole async thing more efficiently than having to rely on an if statement. And also it's built to be in a zoneless space, so it triggers change detection or triggers a change refresh without needing Zone.js, which is quite cool. But like I say, it's experimental, which is unfortunate, so it's not quite ready. But it's a good idea if we prepare for this future by using the async pipe and using a VM. Okay, right, coming back very briefly, I'm just gonna fast forward to the drawbacks. Okay, here's one that Pavel pointed out to me. Are you in the house, Pavel?
I can see him, so he's there.
Oh yeah, he's just being quiet at the moment. Okay, there's a lack of documentation. Yeah, I've found this too, that they only seem to have examples rather than actually drilling into what each method in the library does.
Tom, sorry to interrupt. Talking about unit tests, right? One thing to note is if you use selectors with the bounds operator, right, it's a pain in the back to do unit test, because you can't what do you say? If you use normal without any bed or anything, right? Then you can't use a test scheduler to even fast forward it, because it doesn't support microtasks.
Ah, yes. Yeah. Have you tried using the done
Yeah,
parameter?
it fails before that, because I think
So,
it's a pain. And I think Alex, the author of this library, has mentioned it's a pain in the butt to write unit tests when you use debound. So I don't know how to do it, because the stuff we were working on, I used it and it failed to do the unit test.
I think that would be an interesting one, because I'm surprised that Marbles can't help us out there.
marbles. If you use test scheduler, it will only work when you use async scheduler behind the scene, and asap scheduler doesn't count on that. So it falls over. So
okay, that's a really interesting one, because it's supposedly the case that all of the operators in RxJS can be tested by marbles, but it's suggesting that there's one that you can't.
Yeah, we'll talk, but I think it's about promises, and this Microsoft is to that,
yes.
right? It doesn't deal
Yes.
with.
I've discovered this too, actually, the hard way. I've spent way too long on that. But yeah, if there's a sneaky little promise somewhere in your chain, because promises can be interpreted as observables, so that they work on observable chains in pipe operators and all sorts. But if there's a promise in your chain, and it doesn't matter how short it is, you can't use marbles because it just breaks.
Yeah, and exactly, and that's where this select debouncing falls over, because it uses that micro task after one. So.
Right. Okay, that explains it. The other gripe to an NgRx developer is that you can't use. Yeah, let's go back. Can't use Redux DevTools. Does anybody else use Redux DevTools for any other purpose except NgRx?
Yeah, I do.
Obviously, look up there. Yeah. Alternative to general state management, if you want to go small and use sort of an extended behavior subject to control your entire app, component store would be a useful basic state management tool. Okay, there you go. That's all I've got to say on the subject. Any questions?
I have a question, Tom. I was wondering whether you or anyone else has used, from what I understand, there's a library called Rx Angular, and I think
I have used it. I have used it.
Yeah. So I think NgRx have lifted a lot of the concepts from that, and I was just wondering.
Yeah, there is a behind it. Like the author of Rx Angular State had a fight with Alex Okrusco, so he went out his own way. So he was the original contributor behind this NgRx. You know, Rx led Rx push pipe and stuff, and then they had a big row, and then he went out his own way and created his own library. And he just mentioned because he likes to tell everybody that he just doesn't like Alex Okrusco. So.
Well, you've got to respect someone who's open. That's kind of like in the whole sort of paradigm of open source, isn't it? It's open source hate.
If you sorry, tell me about you asking something. Sorry, I went in a different direction.
Yeah, I was just wondering how you find the comparison between using the two, because they seem quite similar.
I like the Rx Angular State a lot more than this. Because the kind of documentation and the way he tries to tell is more reactive than Alex's approach, where he tries to be more imperative, like calling update methods and these kind of stuff. Whereas the other guy, he's more reactive in his design of the library, and it has definitely a lot more features than this guy has in terms of the capabilities of selectors and stuff. It's more akin to RxJS, more closely related, whereas as Tom mentioned, selector pattern is a bit weird. You have to pass in, you get random parameters coming in, and I think if you see his library is also a lot more complex than this guy's code is one page. His library is obviously more complex and has more features. So
yeah, I can see the benefits to component store if you're using NgRx already, because you then have a unified style across the app.
Yeah. But yeah, and his library released before this, so I used that in one of the projects. But then NgRx, because we use NgRx as kind of default choice for people to prefer NgRx, and it has the label on it, right? NgRx, coming from the NgRx guys, so it all has to be trusted. So I think corporates prefer NgRx stuff more than any random library.
Yeah, it's a much easier persuasion to achieve that. Yes.
But I think using both, right, it kind of achieves the same thing, to be honest. They do the same thing for you. It's just the API that becomes different. And this has still options for imperative use, whereas the other library never allows you to do that. It forces you to pass in streams to update state. Whereas here, if you want to update the state, you can call an updater directly with value in it, right? And you say update this, like it's a more imperative call rather than a streamed call.
Yeah, and it's less opinionated, I suppose, than Rx Angular. But
Yes.
So one interesting thing about the Rx let in Rx Angular is that you can go zoneless with that, and you can choose the scope of the particular. You can choose the scope of the events or things that Zone.js is proxying. So you can do that bit by bit rather than trying to go zoneless across the entire app in one go.
Yeah, I think he has done a lot more work on the template side of things than these guys. He left halfway through. He did half work and then left the project. So his library is it's therefore it's still in beta. I don't think it's going to come out of beta or anything. But yeah, he has completed the stuff in the other library. But I think the problem is it's hard to convince companies to use that, when you have NgRx with you in your organization already, to not use the other one. But yeah, for his zoneless stuff, he has done a lot more research into it. Like he has done, you can do scopes, local scope, global scope and stuff to precisely control how you want to re-render your app, which is definitely a lot more powerful than what NgRx has at the moment from a template point of view.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean his library is pretty cool. It's more technically advanced, I would say, than the other one.
Gav, could you post that into the chat before we disappear?
Yes, Tom, I will. Yeah.
Cool. Anybody else?
Hey Tom, I have a question. It looks great for developers, but what benefits would you say it has for a business? So if I was working for a client and I said to them, there's this new thing in NgRx, and what they would probably say is, well, what benefit would it bring to their business, their application? What kind of things could you say that this sounds like an interview question, doesn't it? What does this benefit them? So, basically, how could you say to them, by adding this to our project, which is what we started in NgRx, what benefits could it give this application? Does it make things faster on the UI, or what's that?
I think if you're already using behavior subjects to give you a view model type scenario, so a single observable to trigger page updates, then you might have a hard time persuading them to use this. I think my favorite argument for it is it gives a clear and precise pattern to implement this kind of view model pattern. okay, rather than a slightly ambiguous behavior subject that is more flexible, because you can tweak it a lot more, you can just do your own thing. But because there's no fixed pattern, and it's not sort of something that people are just coming along and saying, do it this way, it just helps in terms of enterprise to actually have something that everybody can follow. You know, here's a statement, it's not just us, this is what the industry's doing. You can do it this way.
There's a quite good example of that, I think, Tom, this is something we talked about a while ago. So we use the VM pattern, and it's quite easy for people to either by mistake or just not realizing that it's a bad thing to do. It's quite easy for people to sneak in wrong implementations of the view model pattern. So, for example, mutating the view model directly instead of having an immutable view model and providing a new value through the observable, that would cause some difficult to find bugs. And so using something like the component store would force people down a particular route where those kinds of bugs are much less likely to make it into the code. So that's another example of why you might want to use it. It can be a little bit safer for developers, I think.
I think coming back to the one other argument that I gave at the start of this, that this gives you a solution to never subscribe to an observable in your component ever again. I think that's a slam dunk answer. I can't find a better argument for it.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, it sounds quite good that I've seen places where people are trying to implement their own like view model, and it all different. You know, every component can be different if it's written by different people. So I can see definitely the benefits of this, especially for large applications where you've got multiple developers all over the place writing on it.
Well, if you need any help, persuading your stakeholders, you just bring them to me.
I'll do that here.
I think, yeah, Tom's very. We had a call on this. He's very persuasive. I was not sure at the beginning because I use a VM everywhere, and I'm coming around to it, I have to say.
Cool. I'm going to consider that a success.
Yeah.
Has anybody else got any questions before we sort of wrap this up? So just to mention, the website, which is angular2bs.org.uk, okay, will be updated with the links for everything that we've shown tonight, including hopefully the library that Deval has just mentioned.
I think there's a link already posted by Paul.
Oh, marvelous. Well done, Paul. Sorry for not having read that whilst talking. So cheers, I'll get that in there.
Tom, I think you need a round of applause as well for that. That was very good.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna start my slow clap this time. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. I think if anybody hasn't got any questions about, the meetup generally, just as a heads up, it looks like in January we're going to have a new meetup, and also there's a possibility of talking to Stephen here about doing a meetup in February-ish. So we share more coming.
Yes.
So Stephen, I think probably we'll find a separate time to have a little chat about that, if that's cool.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, cool. Sounds good.
It looks like in January we might well have Bonnie Brennan back to do a talk with her daughter Samantha, and I'm sorry I forget his name, but the guy who wrote Scully. So I think that rocks. There you go. So yeah, plenty happening.
guy you're talking about. I can't remember his name either. Sorry.
Yeah, he's a super smart. I think he's from Germany. Certainly got a European accent. So yeah, very nice chap. Looking forward to hearing from him because yeah, I'm dead interested in Scully. Yeah, cool. So if you haven't got any further things you'd like to say, I'll give you 2 seconds to do it. Okay, I'm going to say Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. Stay well, and yeah, I'll see you next year. Okay?
Thank you.
Cheers, Tom.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Happy
you so much.
Christmas.
Thank
See
you. And yeah.
Bye.
Oh, go on. Yep. Cheers. Maria, thank you. I'll ping you later about the video. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you, Maria. That's great.
Cheers. Thanks, guys.
Cool. Cheers, Tom.
Bye-bye. Have a nice